The EFF is in the northwest today to launch its manifesto ahead of the May 29 polls. After its main launch in February, Durban party leader Julius Malema was keen to highlight the failures of the current government. Let's get some analysis from Keegan Leech, researcher at Africa Check. Keegan, good to speak to you this afternoon. I suppose the first place I'd like to start is for us to laboriously define what fact is and just how important facts are in the context of what it is that we are talking about today.
Hi there. Hi.
Keegan, can you hear me and confirm you can hear the question?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? I'm afraid my video has gone.
No problem. We can hear you. Please carry on.
So you asked about what a fact is. In terms of what Africa Check's work is, and in terms of what we can fact check, that means things that we can prove or disprove using publicly available credible information. We can't check a claim about something that hasn't happened yet, or a claim about a person's own personal opinions or beliefs, but something for which there is credible data. That is something that is easily within our wheelhouse.
So the reason I'm asking the question is because there might be exaggerations, for instance, where a party might say or refer to a statistic around poverty and how 20% of the country suffer poverty, or is it 24% or is it 23%? Are those issues a factor? And I'd like to know how the fact-checking organisation evaluate the claim that poverty in South Africa is worse in 2024 than it was in 1994. And what were the challenges in assessing this claim?
Well, the claim that poverty is worse today than in 1994 is one that we couldn't definitively prove true or false, but it's one that it's important to know that, while there isn't definitive proof either way, there is a lot of data and information on. What that data tells us is that poverty seems to have fallen since 1994. Poverty rates have been on the decline according to sort of all the studies that we can find and all of the studies that have been done. But it's really difficult to link those all the way back 30 years. Because two different studies that were done with slightly different methodologies aren't necessarily comparable. They measured poverty in different ways, and the ways that we do measure poverty have changed over time. Then it may be incorrect to say that, a higher rate from 30 years ago is comparable to a lower rate today or something like that. So it's helpful to know that poverty rates have fallen, at least based on all of the data that we have. But we can't actually outright prove this claim incorrect.
So how far back does your data go? I'd imagine that one of your key challenges is if there was very little data or limited data between 1994 and, say, 10 years after 2004, or whatever that period is, that this would be potentially a stumbling block.
Well, there's lots of different studies. For example, the Poverty Trends report from Stats SA was most recently published in 2017, and that goes all the way back to 2006. And that covers, obviously a period of about 10 years there. And it shows that poverty fell over those 10 years, but then it doesn't extend all the way up to today or all the way back to 1994. There are other studies. For example, there was a paper that was released in 2012 that studied the period 1995 to 2005, again, a period of about 10 years, which showed a decline in poverty, but that doesn't extend all the way up to today. So we've got this patchwork of data, and really what we need is a little bit more and a little bit more sort of wide-ranging data, because just relying on this patchwork is a little bit inconclusive.
Well, how conclusive is the fact, let's talk about the processes and verifying the claim that the three wealthiest individuals, or the three wealthiest billionaires in South Africa, own more wealth than the poorest 26 million citizens. I mean, that is absolutely astounding.
It is astounding. An expert said to us that this is essentially saying 3 people own more wealth than the bottom 50% of South Africans. And in this case, it's also very difficult to find exact data. It's very hard to quantify wealth and work out exactly how much wealth these 3 people or these 26 million people collectively own. But the wealth disparity in South Africa is so large, experts told us we can actually make this claim very credibly. There was one study that was done by a group of researchers at WITS in 2017, and it found that the top 0.01% of South Africans, about 3,500 people, owned a combined share of wealth that was greater than that owned by the bottom 90% of South Africans, 32 million people. And it's because that wealth disparity is so massive that we're able to rate this claim correct, even though we don't have the exact numbers, down to the rand.
So you are suggesting that there's a margin of error that is permissible. What is that margin?
It often depends on what the consensus is among researchers who work within a field. At Africa Check, we can't be experts on everything. We obviously aren't going to be experts on poverty and hunger and wealth inequality and all of these things all at the same time. And so we consult with people who work in those fields. If they can be pretty sure, based on existing research, that margin of error falls within the bounds of the claim, then we trust their findings on that. When there is a case where, that margin of error isn't well known or well established, or when that margin of error is wide enough that we can't say for certain exactly where the claim falls, then we are more likely to rate a claim something like unproven.
So how do you verify the information that, not so much that you're getting and are looking for yourselves, but that you're getting from other agencies? I mean, you've talked about, well, we believe them. If they say this is the number, then that's the number. But surely there's got to be a mechanism of you verifying that the information that you are getting is indeed accurate.
That's true. We try and make sure that we're relying on only the best data that we have available to us. And this is something that we encourage other people to look for when they're sent claims. If you can find a source for a claim, you should look at a couple of things to evaluate whether that source is trustworthy. First of all, do the people who are behind that, if it's an organization, or who published that information in the first place, if it's one person, do they actually have experience in this subject? For example, when we're talking about poverty, then StatsSA actually, collects this data regularly. They do very rigorous surveys with large sample sizes, and those surveys are robust and they are trustworthy. If it were a small organization that might have a political motive to collect data that proves a certain viewpoint, or if their studies relied on only very small, narrow groups of people, then that's something to be a little bit more suspicious of. Another thing to ask about the sources that you're going to is sort of how was that data collected? I've already mentioned things like sample sizes. If a survey was done with a large number of people spread out across South Africa so that it covers a large number of demographics, and it's collecting its sources or its input from people who represent South Africans as a whole, then that's a really good sign of reliability. If a survey was done, like I've said, with a small group or with a very narrow sample that's likely to represent only one demographic or not be representative of South Africa as a whole, then that should at least be cause for concern. It doesn't mean that the data is entirely false or entirely unreliable, but then Africa Check, at least, would go looking for other data to fill in the gaps left by that survey.
So let's talk about that big number, and that number is 20,000, and it speaks to the average number of murders that are committed annually in South Africa. Again, just one of those statistics that's That's absolutely incredible. What were the processes in confirming that those findings are indeed correct and that this number is factual?
Well, this is a case where we don't have to worry too much about the accuracy of the data. As one researcher for the Institute of Security Studies told us, murders are a pretty sort of reliable statistic in terms of how they're counted, because dead bodies are hard to hide, dispute, or ignore. It's very difficult to pretend that a dead body doesn't exist. And so murder rates and murder figures are pretty reliable, especially year on year. And so it's easy to work out things like an average. Our complexity here was thinking about over what period was this average taken. It's very accurate if it's an average over the past 10 years. Over that time period, the murder rate was pretty spot on to about 20,000 murders per year on average. And that goes up or down a little bit if you extend or narrow that time range. So over the past 5 years, it goes up a little bit to about 22,000 murders per year. Over the past 20 years, it goes down a little bit to around 19,000. But overall, that variation isn't too big, and it's certainly accurate for about the past 10 years. And the murder rate over those 10 years has been on a pretty constant increase. And because of all of this, we rated that claim correct.
Well, the elections are happening on May 29th, so a little over 2 months away. What are some of the important facts that you've picked up around the election climate, or what's on the horizon?
Well, our focus at the moment is on checking what political parties are saying about South Africa in the lead up to the election. We're checking political party manifestos and manifesto launch speeches at the moment. So we're discussing the EFFs today, but I've spoken to you previously about Rise and Mzansi's. And as the election gets closer, we're going to keep doing that. So we've got more of the major parties coming up, and some of the other parties, the smaller parties or the newer parties that we think are important to cover. And what's important is not necessarily how much each party gets right or wrong. Every party is going to make mistakes because mistakes do happen, no matter how well-intentioned you are. But it's important to see what parties are getting right and wrong, because that's an indication of what their priorities are in the lead up to this election.
Let's unpack the EFF and look at what have they gotten wrong that's most glaring.
Well, two of the claims they made were about land ownership. A claim in their manifesto was that 80% of the population occupies less than 10% of South Africa's land. That claim the EFF put in their last national election manifesto in 2019 as well. And they told us at the time it's not actually about who lives where, it's about who owns land. They had done a calculation where they estimated that black and coloured South Africans owned around 14% of South Africa's land, they told us. And just as it was in 2019, that claim is incorrect. The data that the EFF provided to us that they based their calculation on is not actually accurate to what we know about land ownership.
So what do we know? Let's talk about the discrepancy.
Well, for example, the biggest chunk of land that the EFF discounted in their calculation was what they called white-owned agricultural land. It made up about 67% of their calculation. But that was land as it stood in 1994. It's not accurate to what there is today. And it's very difficult to count exactly who owns what land today. It's difficult to add that up because even the best data we have is from 2015. And that data does show a massive discrepancy in land ownership. It shows that white South Africans own far more land and more land on average than black South Africans and coloured South Africans, but the figures don't match what the EFF has told us.
Sorry, Keegan, we can't criticise the EFF and talk about how inaccurate their numbers are and not give what the actual numbers are. I mean, you can't really say that there's a discrepancy, not tell us what the discrepancy is. So what we'd like to know is, if the EFF said 80% of the land is owned by white people, and it isn't 80%, then what is that number?
Well, there's only about 30% of South African land that we can determine the race of the owner. That's a category called independent privately owned land. But of that category, which is mostly dominated by agricultural land, about 72% is white-owned, the vast majority of it. The portion owned by black and coloured South Africans is closer to 20%. Only about 4% of it is owned by black South Africans.